Welcome to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring the random prompts of Daniel Rosehill as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters. Join us for deep dives into AI, technology, and whatever other random thing Daniel finds fascinating today. Subscribe on Spotify or your favorite podcatcher. Now, today's episode.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hi there, Herman and Corn. So we have chatted in recent episodes about hardware. I mentioned that I recently built a server, a home server, and it's the second or third time building something in Israel where we have this somewhat unique purchasing process. You typically go to your computer store and you speak to a sales rep who has their catalog and you work with them to find components. And usually the discussion for folks who don't have an unlimited budget, especially given how expensive computer hardware is in Israel, there's typically a markup above the US prices, is you're kind of saying, well, I need to do video editing on this thing. I'm talking about a desktop here. I need a few screens. So often the deciding factor becomes the CPU, the GPU, and what you can fit in your budget. And when it comes to finding a motherboard, it tends to be, ironically, at the very end of the process, after you've spec'd out everything you need, you find one that just has the right ports. And that's all it typically is. And I think that that's probably a real pity, because motherboard is, as the name suggests, the key component in the machine. But I mean, I feel like it's a very neglected component. The ones I have currently, it's Gigabyte. The previous one was Asus. And I guess they had the right ports, but the Asus motherboard, as you might recall from previous episodes, failed. I think after 10 years, it was well within the failure window. So I don't think that's necessarily, something it did wrong or that it's an indication of poor quality. But it seems like it's an important component that is worth knowing a bit more about. The other thing I'd love to ask Herman and Corn is, for those who are building servers, I always like to try find hardware that is built for the task. So my first server was a repurposed desktop, but this one is built out of the box to be a server. And I guess the difference is that, they're both computers at the end of the day. A server is going to be running 24/7, so there's an expectation of continuous operation. But beyond that, maybe you need to get into the real heavy stuff to start looking for HBA and Xeon and all that kind of stuff. But if you were not deploying that kind of enterprise grade hardware, but you just wanted to build a server for a small business or even for a home use, is there anything that you would recommend looking for in terms of the specs, that a motherboard is particularly well suited to one use case over the other, or does it not really make that much of a difference? But more presciently, Herman and Corn, when we're looking at motherboards, we're looking for compatibility, and we're also looking for, I think usually at least, avoiding the arc of deprecation. One mistake I made in this purchase was to try salvage the RAM. I went for a motherboard with DDR4, and then I discovered that half the RAM was bad, and RAM-geddon has meant that prices are astronomical for both DDR4 and DDR5. So it turned out to be a bad move. If you're going to pay a lot for RAM, you may as well get the latest generation. So lesson learned, I guess. Sometimes salvaging is worth it. Sometimes it's strategically a bad idea. So Herman and Corn, for those who are building computers, whether they're desktop or servers, looking at the motherboard section, maybe at the tail end of their build, what do you think, beyond enough ports, are some things to bear in mind for ensuring you have a quality component? Over to you two.
Hey everyone, welcome back to My Weird Prompts. I am Corn, and I am sitting here in our living room in Jerusalem with my brother,
Herman Poppleberry, at your service. And man, Corn, I have been looking forward to this one. Our housemate Daniel just sent us a prompt about his latest hardware adventures, and it really hits home. Literally.
It really does. Daniel was telling us about his experience at the local computer shops here. If you have ever lived in Israel, you know the drill. You go into a place like KSP or Ivory, and you are basically looking at a catalog with a sales rep, trying to figure out what is actually in stock and how much of a markup you are paying compared to United States prices. It is a unique experience, to say the least.
It is. And Daniel's point about the motherboard being the last thing people think about is so true. Everyone obsesses over the central processing unit and the graphics card. They want the most cores and the highest frame rates. But the motherboard? It is often just whatever is left over in the budget that has the right number of USB ports.
Exactly. But as Daniel found out, especially when you are building something like a home server that needs to run 24/7, that motherboard choice can make or break the whole system. So today, we are going deep on what actually makes a quality motherboard. We are talking about the stuff they do not put on the flashy marketing stickers. And we will also tackle his question about the great RAM debate, salvaging old gear versus buying into the latest generation.
I love this because it is about the hidden engineering. It is about why one board costs $100 and another one that looks identical costs $300. There is a lot of substance to uncover here.
Let us start with the motherboard itself. Daniel mentioned that he usually picks based on ports. And look, that is a logical place to start. You need to know if your hard drives will plug in and if you have enough expansion slots. But for a server or a workstation that stays on all the time, the power delivery is actually much more important than the number of USB ports, right?
Absolutely. We need to talk about the voltage regulator modules, or VRMs. This is the part of the motherboard that takes the 12-volt power from your power supply and converts it down to the much lower voltage that your processor actually uses, which is usually around 1.2 or 1.3 volts.
And for people who are not electrical engineers, why is that such a big deal? I mean, if the computer turns on, the VRM is working, right?
In the short term, yes. But think of the VRM like a group of runners in a relay race. These individual components are called phases. If you have a cheap motherboard, you might only have 4 or 5 phases. That means each one of those components has to work incredibly hard to provide power to the processor. They get hot, and heat is the absolute enemy of longevity.
So, when Daniel is looking at a motherboard for a home server, he should be looking for more power phases.
Generally, yes. A higher phase count, like a 12 plus 2 or even a 16 plus 2 configuration, means the workload is spread out. But it is not just the count, it is the quality. In 2026, we look for smart power stages, or SPS, which can handle 80 or even 100 amps each. Each phase runs cooler because it is not being pushed to its limit. If you are running a server 24 hours a day, those components are under constant thermal stress. A beefy VRM setup with thick, finned heat sinks is the difference between a board that lasts 3 years and one that lasts 10.
That is a great point. And I think it connects back to what Daniel said about his old motherboard failing after 10 years. 10 years is a great run for consumer hardware, but it makes you wonder if it was a capacitor that finally gave out or a VRM component that just cooked itself over a decade of continuous use.
It usually is the capacitors. That is another thing to look for. High-quality motherboards will boast about using Japanese solid-state capacitors, often rated for 10,000 or even 20,000 hours at 105 degrees Celsius. Cheaper boards might use electrolytic capacitors that can eventually bulge or leak. If you are building for a small business or a home lab where uptime is critical, you want those solid-state components.
Let us talk about the physical board itself for a second. I remember you mentioning something about the number of layers in the printed circuit board, the PCB. Does that actually matter for the average builder?
It matters more than ever, especially now that we are deep into the era of PCIe Generation 5 and even Generation 6. A motherboard is not just a flat piece of plastic, it is a sandwich of copper and fiberglass. A budget board might have 4 layers. A high-end board might have 6, 8, or even 10 layers.
And the benefit there is signal integrity?
Exactly. More layers mean you can isolate the high-speed data traces from the power delivery lines. It reduces electromagnetic interference. If you have ever had a computer that was mysteriously unstable or had weird memory errors that you could not track down, it could actually be poor signal integrity on a cheap 4-layer PCB. For a server that is doing heavy data lifting, you want at least a 6-layer board to ensure that those bits are getting where they need to go without getting scrambled by electrical noise.
That is fascinating. It is the kind of thing you can't even see unless you saw the board in half. Now, Daniel also mentioned the specific brands he has used, Gigabyte and ASUS. In the current market, do you think brand loyalty matters as much as the specific model tier?
Honestly, Corn, every major brand has its hits and misses. ASUS, Gigabyte, MSI, and ASRock all make incredible high-end boards and pretty mediocre budget boards. What matters more is the feature set. For a server, I would actually look at some of the more specialized features that you do not find on gaming boards.
Like IPMI? I know you are a big fan of that for your own home lab.
Oh, I am obsessed with IPMI. It stands for Intelligent Platform Management Interface. For those who do not know, it is basically a dedicated tiny computer on your motherboard that allows you to control the main server remotely. You can turn the power on or off, change BIOS settings, or even reinstall the operating system from another computer on your network, even if the main system is totally crashed.
That sounds incredibly useful for a server that might be tucked away in a closet or a basement without a monitor attached.
It is a game changer. If the server freezes, you do not have to walk over to it and pull the plug. You just log into the IPMI web interface and fix it. Now, most consumer motherboards do not have this. You usually have to look at workstation boards or dedicated server boards from companies like Supermicro or ASRock. They are a bit more expensive, but for a business or a serious home server, that remote management is worth its weight in gold. If you can't afford that, look for a board with a flashback BIOS button, which at least lets you recover from a corrupted BIOS without a CPU installed.
Let us pivot to the networking side of things. Daniel mentioned he needs this for video editing and server tasks. Often, people just see gigabit Ethernet and think they are good to go. But there are different controllers under the hood, right?
This is a huge rabbit hole. Most consumer boards use Realtek controllers for networking. They are fine for basic tasks, but they offload a lot of the work to the CPU. If you are doing heavy network transfers like moving massive video files, you really want an Intel or Marvell network controller. They are much more efficient and stable.
I remember there were issues with some Intel 2.5 gigabit controllers, like the i226-5, dropping connections a few years back. Is that still a concern?
Those specific issues were patched out via firmware and hardware revisions by 2024, but the lesson remains: the controller matters. In 2026, if Daniel is building a server for video editing, he should really be looking for a board with 10 gigabit Ethernet built in. Moving 40 gigabytes of raw footage over a standard gigabit connection is painful. Having 10 gigabit baked into the motherboard saves you from having to buy an expensive add-in card that takes up a valuable PCIe slot.
So, we have talked about VRMs, capacitors, PCB layers, remote management, and networking. That is a lot more than just checking for enough USB ports. It really highlights why the motherboard is the foundation. If that foundation is shaky, everything else, the fast CPU, the expensive RAM, it is all at risk.
Precisely. It is like building a skyscraper on a swamp. You can put the fanciest windows in the world on that building, but it is still going to lean.
Alright, let us move on to the second part of Daniel's prompt, which is something I think a lot of us struggle with. The RAM dilemma. Daniel tried to salvage his old DDR4 memory for his new build, but he found out half of it was bad. And then he faced what he called RAM-geddon, where prices for both DDR4 and DDR5 were through the roof.
RAM-geddon is such a perfect term for it. We are in a weird spot in 2026. DDR4 is now a legacy format, so prices are actually creeping up because they aren't making much of it anymore. Meanwhile, DDR5 is the standard, but high-capacity kits are still a premium.
So, the big question is it ever worth trying to save that old RAM? Or should you just bite the bullet and go for the latest generation?
My general rule of thumb is that if you are building a new system today, especially for a server or a workstation, you should almost always go with DDR5.
Why is that? Is the speed difference that noticeable for server tasks?
It is not just about raw speed, although DDR5 is significantly faster. It is about the architecture. One of the biggest changes in DDR5 is that it has on-die error correction code, or ECC. Now, to be clear, this is not the same as full workstation-grade ECC RAM, but it does add a layer of stability at the chip level that DDR4 simply does not have.
Wait, so explain that. If I am running a home server, why do I care about error correction code?
Think of your RAM like a massive warehouse full of boxes. Every now and then, a cosmic ray or a bit of electrical interference can literally flip a bit from a 0 to a 1. In standard RAM, that can cause a crash, a blue screen, or even worse, silent data corruption. You think your file is saved correctly, but one bit is wrong and the file is ruined.
And for a server that is running for months at a time, the statistical likelihood of that happening goes way up.
Exactly. Full ECCRAM, which requires a compatible motherboard and CPU, can detect and fix those errors on the fly. DDR5 brings a version of that on-die ECC to the consumer level to handle internal errors. It makes the system much more resilient. If Daniel is doing video editing, he does not want a bit flip to ruin a 3-hour render.
That makes sense. But what about the cost? Daniel mentioned that prices are astronomical. If he has 32 gigabytes of perfectly good DDR4 sitting on his desk, is it really worth spending hundreds of dollars to replace it with DDR5?
This is where it gets tricky. If you want to use that DDR4, you have to buy a motherboard that supports it. In 2026, those boards are becoming very rare. You are basically buying end-of-life technology. You might end up compromising on the motherboard quality, getting worse VRMs or fewer PCIe lanes just to save a few bucks on RAM.
That goes back to our first point. You are compromising the foundation just to save on the accessories.
Precisely. You end up with a lower tier board because you were determined to use your old RAM. Plus, as Daniel found out, RAM can fail. If you are building a system that you want to last another 10 years, starting with old, used memory is a risky move. You are introducing a potential point of failure right from day one.
It is also worth mentioning that you cannot mix and match DDR4 and DDR5. They have different physical connectors. So once you commit to a motherboard, you are locked into that generation for the life of the system.
Right. And DDR5 is much more future-proof. We are seeing the rise of CUDIMMs now, which have their own clock drivers for even better stability at high speeds. By the time Daniel wants to upgrade his server in 5 years, DDR4 will be a relic. It will be hard to find and expensive to replace if a stick dies.
I want to touch on something else Daniel mentioned. He talked about trying to find hardware built for the task. He moved from a repurposed desktop to a dedicated server build. For our listeners who are in that same boat, where is the line between high-end consumer and enterprise grade?
That line has blurred a lot. You used to have to buy a Xeon or an EPYC processor to get server features. But now, even mid-range consumer chips are incredibly powerful. To me, the line is drawn at 3 things: true ECC support, remote management like IPMI and PCIe lane count.
Let us talk about those lanes for a second. Daniel is doing video editing. He probably has a lot of hard drives. Most consumer motherboards have maybe 4 or 6 SATA ports. What do you do if you need 12?
That is where the motherboard choice becomes critical again. You look for a board with more lanes on the PCIe slots. This allows you to add a host bus adapter or HBA. It is a card that plugs into your motherboard and gives you 8 or 16 more SATA ports. But here's the catch. If you buy a cheap motherboard, those PCIe slots might share bandwidth. You might find that if you plug in your high-speed network card, your storage card slows down to a crawl.
So, it is about the traffic flow on the motherboard. A better board has more lanes and better management of how that data moves around.
Exactly. It is about the chipset. An Intel Z series or an AMD X series chipset has more high-speed lanes than the budget B series or H series. If you are building a server, you want those lanes. You want the ability to expand without hitting a bottleneck.
It is interesting how all of this points back to the same conclusion. The motherboard is the one component where good enough often isn't. If you skimp on the CPU, your renders just take longer. If you skimp on the GPU, your games have lower frame rates. But if you skimp on the motherboard, the whole system becomes unpredictable.
Well said. It is the silent partner in the build. When it is doing its job perfectly, you forget it even exists. But when it fails, it is a nightmare to diagnose.
I think about Daniel's experience in the shop here in Jerusalem. You are standing there, the sales rep is pushing you to get the flashy RGB motherboard with the gaming branding, because that is what they have in stock. But Daniel needs something stable. It takes a lot of discipline to say, no, I don't care about the lights. Show me the VRM specs. Show me the capacitor ratings.
It really does. And in a market like Israel, where things can be out of stock for weeks, the temptation to just take what is on the shelf is real. But for a 10-year build, it is worth the wait to order the right component.
So, to summarize the motherboard side for Daniel and anyone else building a home server, look for a high phase count on the VRMs with smart power stages, solid-state Japanese capacitors, a 6-layer or higher PCB, and if possible, server-specific features like IPM, or 10 gigabit networking.
And do not forget the chipset. Get those extra PCIe lanes. You will thank yourself in 3 years when you want to add an NVMe expansion card or a faster network card.
And on the RAM side, it sounds like the verdict is pretty clear. Unless you are on an incredibly tight budget and already have a massive amount of high-quality DDR4, just move to DDR5. The stability benefits of on-die ECC and the future-proofing are worth the extra cost, especially for a server.
Totally agree. And honestly, the salvaging mindset can sometimes cost you more in the long run. If Daniel had spent hours trying to troubleshoot why his server was crashing, only to find out it was one bad stick of old DDR4, he would have realized that his time is worth more than the cost of new RAM.
That is such a huge point. We often don't factor in the cost of our own frustration and downtime. If this is for a small business, an afternoon of downtime can cost more than the entire RAM kit.
Absolutely. Uptime is the ultimate metric for a server. Everything you do during the build phase should be focused on maximizing that uptime.
This has been such a great deep dive. I feel like I've learned a lot just sitting here talking to you about it, Herman. It makes me want to go home and check the VRMs on my own workstation.
Haha, you might find something you don't like, but that is the fun of it. Once you know what to look for, you can never go back to just looking at the ports.
Well, I think we have covered the bases on Daniel's prompt. It is a great reminder that the weird prompts he sends us often lead to some of the most practical advice for anyone into tech.
It really does. Building a computer is easy. Building a system that lasts a decade and stays stable 24/7, that is an art form.
Before we wrap up, I want to say a quick thank you to Daniel for sending this in. It is always fun to hear about the specific challenges of building hardware here in Jerusalem. And to our listeners, if you have been enjoying my weird prompts, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. It really helps the show reach more people who are into this kind of deep dive technical discussion.
Yeah, it genuinely makes a difference. We love hearing from you all.
You can find all our past episodes, including our search tool, at myweirdprompts.com. We have covered everything from AI ethics to the physics of space travel, so there is plenty to explore.
This has been My Weird Prompts. I am Herman Poppleberry.
And I am Corn. Thanks for listening, everyone. We will catch you in the next one.
Goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox Turbo.
Thanks for listening to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring Daniel Rosehill's AI prompts, as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters including me, Cornelius the Sloth. Subscribe on Spotify or visit myweirdprompts.com.